The morning sun shone through the tall glass windows of the Network One building in downtown Washington, D.C. Inside, the hallways buzzed with activity as producers, makeup artists, and camera operators prepared for another day of live broadcasts. On the third floor, in a modest green room with comfortable blue couches and a coffee table filled with water bottles, sat Karoline Leavitt. At 29 years old, Karoline had already built a reputation as a sharp and level-headed communicator. Her blonde hair was neatly styled, and she wore a crisp navy blazer over a white blouse. She checked her watch. Still 45 minutes before the show would go live. "More coffee, Ms. Leavitt?" asked a young production assistant who poked his head through the door. "Yes, please. Black with 1 sugar," Karoline replied with a smile. As the assistant left, she returned to reviewing her notes on her tablet. Today's topic was the new economic bill that had been making headlines for weeks. She knew it would be a heated discussion. Just then her phone buzzed with a text message from her former boss. "You'll do great today. Remember, facts over feelings." Karoline smiled at the familiar advice. It had become something of a personal motto for her. In a world of loud voices and extreme statements, she had found that calm, fact-based arguments often cut through the noise better than shouting ever could. The door opened again, and in walked Linda Evans, the show's executive producer. Linda was a tall woman in her 50s with streaks of gray in her dark hair and the hurried manner of someone perpetually running late. "Karoline, good to see you again," Linda said, extending her hand. "We've had a last-minute change. Congressman Miller had to cancel. His flight was delayed in Chicago. But we've got Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez joining us remotely instead." Karoline nodded, hiding her surprise. AOC, as she was commonly known, was a much higher-profile opponent than she had expected. Known for her passionate speeches and large social media following, the New York representative had become one of the most recognizable faces in American politics. "That works for me," Karoline said calmly. "What's the format again?" 10 minutes, total. Sarah will moderate. Opening statements of 1 minute each, then questions. We're focusing on the economic impact of the bill, particularly how it affects everyday Americans. Linda glanced at her clipboard. AOC goes first, then you respond. After Linda left, Karoline took a deep breath. She opened a new document on her tablet and began typing additional notes. If AOC was joining, she needed to be extra prepared. The representative was known for making emotional appeals about America's flaws, claims that often went viral but didn't always match with reality. Karoline spent the next 30 minutes researching recent statements AOC had made about the economy. She noted unemployment statistics, inflation rates, and examples of American success stories that contradicted the narrative of a failing nation. Facts would be her strongest weapon. A knock on the door interrupted her preparation. 5-minute warning, Ms. Leavitt, called a voice. Karoline gathered her notes, took one last sip of coffee, and followed a production assistant through the maze of corridors. The studio was smaller than it appeared on television, a simple desk with 3 chairs, surrounded by cameras and bright lights. Behind the desk, large screens showed the Network One logo. "We'll have Representative Ocasio-Cortez on this monitor," explained a technician, pointing to a screen to the right of the desk. "You'll be able to see and hear her clearly." Sarah Chen, the show's host for 3 years, walked in wearing a red dress and carrying her own set of notes. She had a reputation for being fair but tough. She didn't let guests off easy, regardless of their political party. "Karoline, good to have you back on the show," Sarah said, shaking her hand. "This should be an interesting segment. Thanks for having me," Karoline replied. "I'm looking forward to it." As they took their seats, technicians attached microphones to their collars and checked sound levels. On the monitor, AOC appeared, sitting in what looked like an office in New York. She wore a bright red blazer and gold hoop earrings. "Good morning, Representative Ocasio-Cortez," Sarah called out. "Can you hear us clearly?" "Yes, good morning," AOC replied, her voice coming through the studio speakers. "I can hear you perfectly." "Great. We'll be live in 2 minutes." Karoline took a moment to center herself. She knew that millions of people would be watching. In today's divided political landscape, these conversations mattered. People were tired of shouting matches and wanted substance. She intended to give them exactly that. 30 seconds, called the floor director. Sarah straightened her papers. AOC adjusted her position on screen. Karoline took one last deep breath, and 5, 4, 3. The director counted down silently with his fingers for the final 2 seconds. The red light on the camera lit up. Good morning and welcome to The Bottom Line. I'm Sarah Chen, the host began with practiced ease. Today we're discussing the Economic Opportunity Act, which passed the House last week and now heads to the Senate. This bill has sparked intense debate about America's economic future. Joining me are Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who voted against the bill, and Karoline Leavitt, former White House spokesperson who has been advocating for its passage. Sarah turned toward the camera. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, let's start with you. Why do you believe this bill is wrong for America? The monitor showed AOC leaning slightly forward, her expression serious. Thank you for having me, Sarah. The truth is, this bill is just another example of how our system continues to fail working Americans. While claiming to create opportunity, it actually funnels more money to those who already have it. In today's America, we're seeing record corporate profits, while regular people struggle to pay for groceries and rent. Her voice grew more passionate as she continued. This country was built on the promise that hard work would lead to success, but that promise is broken for too many people. Our infrastructure is crumbling, healthcare remains unaffordable, and the wealthy continue to avoid paying their fair share. This bill does nothing to address these fundamental problems and instead makes them worse. We need to stop pretending America is working for everyone when the evidence clearly shows it isn't. We need bold, transformative change, not more of the same policies that have created such deep inequality. Sarah nodded. Thank you, Representative. Karoline Leavitt, your response? The camera turned to Karoline, who sat with perfect posture, her expression calm but engaged. This was the moment she had prepared for. Millions of viewers were watching, waiting to see how she would respond to AOC's criticism of America. Karoline knew that what she said next would matter. She needed to be firm but not angry, confident but not arrogant, and most importantly, she needed to use facts to counter emotional appeals. She took a small breath and began to speak. Karoline smiled slightly as the camera focused on her. The bright studio lights felt warm on her face, but she remained cool and collected. Thank you, Sarah, Karoline began, her voice clear and steady. And thank you, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, for sharing your perspective. She placed her hands flat on the desk and looked directly into the camera. I have to respectfully disagree with the characterization of America that we just heard. The United States isn't a perfect country. No nation is. But to suggest it's fundamentally broken does a disservice to millions of Americans who are thriving and building better lives every day. Karoline pulled out a small note card with key statistics she had prepared. Let's look at some facts. Before the pandemic, we saw record low unemployment rates across all demographics. Small business creation is currently at an all-time high. And despite challenges, America remains the #1 destination for immigrants seeking opportunity worldwide. These aren't signs of a broken system. On the monitor, AOC shifted in her seat, her expression showing clear disagreement. But Karoline continued calmly. The Economic Opportunity Act addresses real concerns by reducing regulations that hurt small businesses, expanding job training programs in underserved communities, and creating tax incentives for companies that manufacture in America. These are practical solutions that help real people. Sarah Chen nodded and turned toward the monitor. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you mentioned inequality. How do you respond to Ms. Leavitt's points? The camera cut to AOC, who leaned forward with intensity. Those statistics don't tell the whole story. When people can't afford housing or health care despite working full-time jobs, something is deeply wrong. The wealth gap continues to grow wider every year. This bill, AOC continued, her voice rising slightly, gives more tax breaks to corporations that already pay too little. Meanwhile, Everyday Americans struggle with rising costs. The American dream isn't accessible to most people anymore. Rayo turned back to Karoline. Your response? Karoline nodded thoughtfully. I appreciate Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's concern for working Americans. We share that concern, but I believe we need to be accurate about both challenges and successes. She reached for a glass of water and took a small sip before continuing. Yes, healthcare and housing costs are serious issues that need addressing, but suggesting the American dream is dead ignores the millions of success stories happening every day. Karoline shifted slightly in her chair. Last month, I visited a community in Michigan where a former auto factory closed 10 years ago. Instead of giving up, local entrepreneurs converted that space into a business incubator. Today, over 50 small businesses operate there, employing more people than the factory did. That's the American spirit. Finding opportunity even in difficult circumstances. The studio was quiet for a moment as her words settled in. Sarah looked impressed by the specific example. Representative, Karoline continued, addressing AOC directly. When we constantly talk down about America, we discourage the very people who are working to make things better. Criticism has its place, but so does recognizing what's working. AOC's expression tightened. That's one success story, but it doesn't change the systemic problems. And pointing out those problems isn't talking down about America. It's being honest about what needs to change. Sarah Chen seized the moment. Let's dig into specifics of the bill. Section 230 reduces corporate tax rates for companies that create jobs in underserved communities. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you've called this a giveaway to corporations. Ms. Leavitt, you've called it smart incentivizing. Can we explore this difference? AOC spoke first. These tax breaks rarely benefit the communities they claim to help. Companies take the money and still pay workers too little. We've seen this pattern for decades. When it was her turn, Karoline pulled out her tablet and opened a document. I understand that concern, which is why this bill is different. It includes accountability measures. Companies only get the tax benefit after jobs are created, not before, and the jobs must pay above the median wage for that area. She looked up from her tablet. The bill also includes penalties for companies that take the benefit and then move jobs overseas within 5 years. This isn't the same policy approach we've seen before. AOC shook her head on the screen. The enforcement mechanisms are too weak. And why are we still using a trickle-down approach when it has failed repeatedly? I wouldn't call this trickle-down economics, Karoline replied. This is about creating the right conditions for job growth in places that need it most. The bill also includes direct funding for community colleges to train workers for these new jobs. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Sarah directing specific questions about different parts of the bill. Throughout the exchange, AOC's passion was evident. She spoke quickly, her hands often moving to emphasize points, her voice occasionally rising. In contrast, Karoline maintained her calm demeanor. She addressed each point methodically, referring to specific sections of the bill and providing concrete examples. When AOC made a particularly charged statement about corporate greed, viewers noticed how Karoline didn't take the bait to respond emotionally. The data simply doesn't support that conclusion, she would say before citing relevant statistics. Or, that's a compelling argument, but here's what the bill actually does, followed by specific details that contradicted AOC's characterization. Halfway through the segment, Sarah brought up a tweet AOC had posted the previous day, which claimed, "The bill would devastate working families." Ms. Leavitt, how do you respond to that assessment? Sarah asked. Karoline's expression remained respectful but firm. I think it's that kind of extreme language that makes it difficult to have productive conversations about policy. This bill won't devastate anyone. It might not do everything the representative wants, but its provisions are modest and targeted. She turned slightly toward the monitor where AOC appeared. I believe Americans deserve debates based on the actual content of legislation, not frightening characterizations that don't match reality. For the first time, AOC looked slightly thrown off balance. The camera caught her pausing before responding. My constituents are genuinely worried about their economic future, AOC said, her tone defensive. I speak for them when I express these concerns strongly. And they deserve representatives who are passionate about their interests, Karoline acknowledged. But they also deserve accuracy. When we exaggerate the negative effects of policies we disagree with, we contribute to the fear and division in our country. The atmosphere in the studio shifted. Sarah Chen, sensing the changing dynamic, leaned forward. We're approaching the halfway point of our segment. Let's turn to the international aspects of this bill. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you've expressed concerns about the trade provisions. As AOC began to answer, the camera briefly caught Karoline making notes on her tablet. Her expression remained attentive and engaged. Though the debate was growing more intense, she appeared completely comfortable, like someone who had prepared thoroughly and was confident in her position. Behind the scenes, the show's producer spoke into the control room microphone. This is good. Really good. Let's extend this segment if possible. The floor director gave a subtle nod to Sarah, indicating she should continue this line of questioning. The conversation was just heating up, and the real confrontation was about to begin. Let's move to the impact on urban communities, Sarah Chen said, turning the conversation toward a new direction. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, your district includes parts of the Bronx and Queens. How do you believe this bill will affect your constituents specifically? The camera cut to AOC, who seemed eager to bring the discussion back to her home territory. My district is filled with hardworking people who struggle every day, AOC began, her voice gaining strength. Many work 2 or 3 jobs just to afford rent. They're the people who keep New York running, the food delivery workers, home health aides, retail employees. This bill offers them nothing but empty promises. She leaned closer to her camera. Meanwhile, it gives tax breaks to the wealthy, developers who are gentrifying neighborhoods and pushing my constituents out of their homes. This is why I say America isn't working for everyone, because I see the struggle every day. Sarah nodded and turned to Karoline. Ms. Leavitt, your response? Karoline had been making notes during AOC's answer. She set her pen down and looked up. I appreciate the representative's concern for her constituents. They're exactly the kind of Americans this bill aims to help, Karoline said. Section 403 specifically addresses urban housing affordability through zoning reform incentives, which experts across the political spectrum agree is one of the best ways to increase housing supply and reduce costs. She turned a page in her notes. The bill also includes funding for vocational training programs designed for exactly the workers the representative mentioned. People working multiple jobs who need skills to access higher-paying opportunities. Karoline paused briefly. What doesn't help these workers is constantly telling them the system is rigged against them. That message takes away hope. And hope, combined with opportunity, is what drives progress. AOC's expression changed to one of frustration. Hope doesn't pay the bills, she said sharply, and acknowledging reality isn't taking away hope. It's the first step toward making real change. I agree that acknowledging challenges is important, Karoline replied calmly. But there's a difference between acknowledging problems and suggesting America is fundamentally broken. The data simply doesn't support that view. Karoline pulled out a small card with more statistics. Urban entrepreneurship is actually growing, faster in communities like the Bronx than in many wealthy neighborhoods. Access to online learning has opened doors that weren't available before, and despite real challenges, immigrant communities continue to build successful businesses and pathways to the middle class. She looked directly at the camera. These success stories don't mean the problems aren't real. They mean that even with those problems, the American dream is still alive. Our job should be making that dream accessible to more people, not declaring it dead. The studio grew quiet. Even Sarah seemed impressed by how Karoline had reframed the conversation. On the monitor, AOC's frustration was visible. She had been expecting the usual talking points, not this measured, fact-based approach. The bill still doesn't address the root causes of inequality, AOC insisted. We need structural change, not Band-Aids. I think we can agree that Band-Aids aren't enough, Karoline nodded. But where we differ is in our assessment of what structural change looks like. Creating conditions for job growth, improving education, and increasing housing supply are structural approaches. They address root causes. Sarah Chen seized on this point. That raises an interesting question about your different visions for America. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you've advocated for a more European-style social welfare system. Ms. Leavitt, you've emphasized growth and opportunity. Can you both elaborate on these different visions? AOC went first, outlining her vision of expanded government programs, higher taxes on the wealthy, and stronger regulations on business. She spoke passionately about countries like Denmark and Sweden as models America should follow. When it was her turn, Karoline's approach was measured but equally powerful. America has always found its own path to progress, she said. Our strength comes from our unique combination of free enterprise, innovation, and community spirit. The countries Representative Ocasio-Cortez mentions have many admirable qualities, but they also have challenges, including high costs of living, housing shortages, and integration difficulties. Karoline leaned forward slightly. But more importantly, they have different histories and cultures. What works there may not work here. Instead of importing systems from other countries, I believe we should build on what has made America exceptional: our entrepreneurial spirit, our diversity, and our tradition of solving problems from the bottom up rather than the top down. She continued, when government tries to solve every problem, it often creates new ones. The bill we're discussing takes a balanced approach, providing support where needed while creating space for Americans to find their own solutions. The contrast between the two women was becoming more striking with each exchange. AOC's passionate advocacy versus Karoline's reasoned analysis. AOC's criticism of American systems versus Karoline's belief in American potential. Sarah turned back to AOC. Representative, how do you respond to the suggestion that your criticism of America goes too far and potentially discourages the very people you want to help? AOC's expression hardened. That's a talking point designed to silence legitimate criticism. Pointing out problems isn't being anti-American, it's being honest. And people know when you're being honest with them. There's a difference between honest criticism and painting an unnecessarily bleak picture, Karoline responded. When you tweeted last week that the American dream is dead for most people, how does that help a young person in your district? Who's working hard to build a better life? For the first time, AOC seemed slightly caught off guard. I was speaking to the statistical reality that upward mobility has declined, she said defensively. But even that isn't completely accurate, Karoline replied. Recent studies from Stanford and Harvard show that mobility varies widely by region and community. In some areas, including parts of New York City, upward mobility remains strong. Telling people their dreams are statistically impossible doesn't serve them well. The conversation continued, with Sarah asking increasingly specific questions about policy details. Throughout the exchange, a pattern emerged. AOC would make a broad emotional statement about America's failings. Karoline would acknowledge the concern but then methodically dismantle the overgeneralization with specific facts, examples, and nuance. In the control room, producers watched with growing excitement. The show's social media manager whispered to the executive producer, "This is going viral already. Clips are being shared everywhere." On screen, the debate had turned to the bill's environmental provisions. This bill does nothing to address the climate crisis, AOC stated firmly. It's a betrayal of future generations. Karoline looked directly at AOC's image on the monitor. Representative, with respect, have you read Section 720 through 735? Those 16 sections include the largest investment in clean energy manufacturing in American history. They fund research into next-generation battery technology and provide tax incentives for carbon capture. She flipped through her tablet to specific pages. The bill may not include everything you wanted, but saying it does nothing isn't accurate. This kind of all-or-nothing rhetoric makes compromise impossible. Sarah checked her earpiece where a producer was giving her instructions. We're going to extend this segment, she announced to both guests. This conversation is clearly striking a chord with viewers. The floor director held up a sign indicating they would be continuing for an additional 10 minutes. AOC adjusted her position, looking somewhat frustrated but determined. Karoline, meanwhile, appeared completely at ease, as if she could continue this discussion all day. Let's talk about specific amendments you proposed, Representative, Sarah suggested, turning to AOC. 3 were rejected and 1 was accepted. Can you walk us through those? As AOC began explaining her amendments, Karoline jotted down notes, preparing for what would become the most decisive moment of the debate. AOC finished explaining her proposed amendments to the bill, emphasizing how they would have increased funding for climate initiatives and added stronger worker protections. These changes would have made the bill actually help working people, she concluded. Instead, the majority rejected them because they care more about corporate interests than real Americans. Sarah Chen turned to Karoline. Your thoughts on these amendments? Karoline nodded thoughtfully. I appreciate the representative's passion for these issues, and I agree that worker protections and climate action are important. But policy discussions require precision and honesty about trade-offs. She tapped her tablet screen. The first amendment Representative Ocasio-Cortez proposed would have added $200 billion in spending without identifying a funding source. That's not responsible governance. Karoline looked directly at the camera. And the claim that rejecting these amendments means legislators don't care about real Americans is exactly the kind of divisive rhetoric that damages our political discourse. People can disagree on policy approaches while still caring deeply about the same outcomes. AOC's expression hardened. When people vote against basic protections for workers, their actions speak louder than words. Let's look at the actual votes, Karoline replied calmly. Your third amendment was rejected 267 to 168, with 42 members of your own party voting against it. Are you suggesting all those representatives, including many from working-class districts, don't care about workers? For a moment, AOC seemed unsure how to respond. She glanced down at her notes before speaking again. Many members face pressure from donors and special interests, she said finally. Or perhaps, Karoline suggested, they recognized that while the amendment had good intentions, its implementation would have created unintended consequences for the very workers it aimed to help. The Congressional Budget Office analysis suggested it could lead to job losses in manufacturing sectors. Sarah Chen recognized this was a pivotal moment in the debate. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, would you like to respond to that point? AOC's frustration was becoming more visible. The CBO analysis was based on flawed assumptions, she insisted, and it's convenient to talk about unintended consequences when you don't want to support real change. Karoline remained composed. I think we all want real change that improves people's lives. We just disagree on the best approaches to achieve that goal. She paused for a moment, then continued with renewed purpose. This is what troubles me about some of the rhetoric we hear today. The suggestion that those who disagree with certain policies don't care about working people or are somehow against progress. Karoline leaned forward slightly. America has always been a place where we can debate ideas vigorously without questioning each other's basic goodness or love of country. That tradition is what allows us to find solutions that stand the test of time. The studio grew quiet. Even Sarah seemed struck by the shift in tone. After a moment, Sarah said, Representative, your response? AOC appeared momentarily thrown off balance. Her usual confidence seemed shaken by Karoline's refusal to engage in the typical political back and forth. The stakes are too high for business as usual, AOC said, her voice rising slightly. Climate change threatens our future. Inequality is destroying communities. When I speak strongly, it's because these issues demand urgency. I agree these issues are urgent, Karoline nodded. But urgency doesn't justify inaccuracy, and it certainly doesn't justify the kind of rhetoric that divides Americans from each other. She turned her tablet around to show a social media post on the screen. Just last month you posted that America has become a playground for the rich while everyone else suffers. That statement ignores the lived reality of millions of middle-class Americans who are neither rich nor suffering. Karoline set the tablet down. These kinds of extreme statements might generate likes and shares, but they don't reflect the complex reality of our country, and they make it harder to build the coalitions needed for real progress. The camera caught AOC's expression, which had changed from frustration to something closer to defensive anger. "So we should just ignore problems and pretend everything is fine?" AOC asked sharply. "Not at all," Karoline replied, her voice still measured and calm. "We should acknowledge problems honestly, without exaggeration, and then work together on solutions. That's how America has always overcome its challenges." Sarah Chen sensed it was time to move the conversation forward. "Let's talk about specific communities that would be affected by this bill. Ms. Leavitt, you mentioned visiting Michigan recently. Tell us more about what you saw there." Karoline's face brightened. "What I saw in Lansing was America at its best. A community that faced economic hardship when manufacturing jobs left, but refused to give up. Local leaders, both Democrats and Republicans, worked together to attract new businesses." She described meeting a woman named Maria, who had lost her factory job after 22 years, but used a community college program to learn new skills. Today, Maria manages a team at a medical device company, earning more than she did before. "Her story isn't unique. I met dozens of people with similar experiences." Karoline's voice grew warmer as she continued. "That's what makes America special. Our resilience, our innovation, our refusal to be defined by our challenges. The Economic Opportunity Act supports communities like Lansing by expanding those successful local initiatives." Sarah turned to AOC. "Representative, your district has also faced economic challenges. How do you see this differently?" AOC spoke about the struggles in her district: rising rents, low wages, and limited opportunities. Her passion was evident, but after Karoline's positive examples, her message seemed increasingly negative by comparison. "The system is designed to keep people trapped in poverty," AOC concluded. "With respect," Karoline responded, "that view disempowers the very people you want to help. When you tell people the system is designed to make them fail, what motivation do they have to try?" She continued, "In my travels across America, I've seen communities facing similar challenges to your district. But I've also seen remarkable success stories: immigrant families opening businesses, young people creating tech startups in unlikely places, workers transitioning from declining industries to growing ones." Karoline's voice remained steady and confident. "These successes don't mean the challenges aren't real, but they show that even with those challenges, the American dream is still achievable. Our job as leaders should be highlighting these paths forward, not telling people they're victims of a rigged system." The contrast between the two approaches had never been clearer. AOC focused on systemic problems and the need for dramatic change. Karoline acknowledged challenges but emphasized solutions and possibilities. In the control room, the social media manager whispered to the executive producer, "Karoline's points about resilience and opportunity are resonating across all platforms." Clips are being shared with comments like, "Finally someone speaking truth, and this is the message America needs." Sarah checked her notes before asking the next question. "We're in the final minutes of our extended segment. I'd like each of you to address directly why Americans should support or oppose this bill." AOC went first, summarizing her opposition based on what she saw as the bill's inadequate response to climate change, inequality, and corporate power. When it was Karoline's turn, she took a deep breath. She knew this was her opportunity to deliver her most powerful message, the one that would define this entire exchange. "This bill isn't perfect," Karoline began. "No legislation ever is, but it represents something important, a practical approach to real problems facing American communities." She put down her notes and spoke directly to the camera. "Throughout this discussion, we've heard two very different views of America. One sees a broken system where most people can't succeed. The other, the one I believe, sees a nation with challenges but also incredible strengths and opportunities." Karoline's voice grew stronger, though still measured and calm. "The question isn't whether America has problems. Of course we do. The question is whether we still have the capacity to solve them. I believe we do. The studio was completely silent as she continued, building toward what would become the most memorable moment of the entire debate. Karoline paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The studio lights seemed to focus on her as she prepared to deliver her final message. "Let me share something I've observed traveling across this country," she began. "When I visit communities that are thriving despite challenges, I always ask local leaders what made the difference. Their answer is almost always the same. It wasn't a government program or policy that transformed their community. It was a change in mindset." She leaned forward slightly. They stopped seeing themselves as victims of economic change and started seeing themselves as authors of their own future. They stopped waiting for someone else to save them and started building solutions themselves. Karoline's voice remained calm but carried a quiet intensity. "That's the spirit that built America, the belief that our destiny is in our own hands. When we tell people the system is rigged against them, we rob them of that belief. We take away their agency and replace it with resentment." On the monitor, AOC's expression had changed from frustration to something more thoughtful, as if she was truly listening. "This bill isn't just about economic policies," Karoline continued. "It's about restoring that sense of possibility. It creates pathways for communities to build their own solutions, rather than waiting for Washington to solve everything." She gestured toward the camera. "Americans watching this show don't need politicians telling them how broken everything is. They know the challenges they face. What they need is leaders who believe in their capacity to overcome those challenges, who offer practical tools, and then trust communities to use them wisely." Sarah Chen nodded, clearly impressed by the substance behind Karoline's words. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, your final thoughts? AOC had regained some of her composure. "I agree that mindset matters," she said, "but structural barriers are real, and no amount of positive thinking can overcome systemic inequality without policy changes." She continued for another minute, returning to her main points about the need for bolder action on climate change and economic justice. When she finished, Sarah turned back to Karoline. "Ms. Leavitt, you have 30 seconds for a final statement." Karoline nodded. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez and I clearly have different views about America, but I think we both want the same thing: a country where everyone has the opportunity to build a good life." Her expression was earnest as she continued. "Where we differ is that I believe that country already exists, not perfectly but fundamentally. The American dream isn't dead. It's alive in communities across this nation, including in the Bronx and Queens." She looked directly at the camera for her final words. "Our job isn't to tear down and rebuild America. It's to make the American dream more accessible to everyone. This bill takes practical steps toward that goal, and that's why it deserves support." "Thank you both," Sarah said as the segment concluded. That was Karoline Leavitt and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez discussing the Economic Opportunity Act. We'll be right back after these messages. As the red light on the camera turned off, indicating they were no longer live, Sarah removed her microphone. "That was one of the best discussions we've had on this show," she said to Karoline. "Thank you both." On the monitor, AOC nodded briefly before her connection ended. She had maintained her passionate advocacy throughout, but the contrast with Karoline's measured approach had been striking to everyone watching. A production assistant helped Karoline remove her microphone. "Your phone has been buzzing non-stop," he mentioned. "I think the segment made quite an impression." In the green room afterward, Karoline checked her messages. Her former boss had texted, "Perfect execution. You showed exactly how to counter emotional appeals with facts and optimism." Another message from a colleague read, "You just gave a masterclass in effective communication. Calm, factual, and positive beats angry and negative every time." As Karoline gathered her things to leave the studio, Linda Evans, the executive producer, knocked on the door. "I wanted to thank you personally," Linda said. "That segment is already our most viewed clip of the year. It's being shared everywhere." Karoline smiled. "I'm glad people found it valuable." "It wasn't just valuable, it was refreshing," Linda replied. So much of our political discourse these days is people talking past each other or trying to score points. You actually engaged with the substance while staying respectful. Linda hesitated, then added, "We'd love to have you back as a regular contributor if you're interested." "I'll think about it," Karoline promised. "Thank you for the opportunity." Today, as she left the building and stepped into the bright midday sun, Karoline checked her phone again. The clips from the segment were indeed going viral. One short video titled, "Karoline Leavitt Calmly Destroys AOC for Trashing America," had already been viewed over 1 million times. But what caught her attention wasn't the dramatic headline. It was the comments below the video. "I've been feeling so discouraged about politics lately. This gave me hope that reasonable conversation is still possible. I don't agree with everything she said, but her positive vision of America is what we need right now. This is how you debate effectively, with facts, respect, and confidence." Walking to her car, Karoline reflected on the experience. She hadn't set out to destroy anyone. Her goal had been simply to present a different vision of America, one that acknowledged problems but emphasized possibilities. Later that evening, Karoline received an unexpected email. It was from a high school teacher in the Bronx, in AOC's district. "I showed the clip of your debate to my civics class today," the teacher wrote. "My students come from diverse backgrounds and have diverse political views. But they all agreed on one thing. They appreciated how you disagreed without being disagreeable. You showed them that political discourse doesn't have to be about who can shout the loudest." The message continued. One student said something that stuck with me. She believes in America, but not in a blind way. She sees the problems, but still thinks we can fix them. In a time when young people are increasingly cynical about politics, that kind of balanced optimism is powerful. Karoline smiled as she finished reading the email. This was why she had entered politics in the first place, not to win arguments but to promote a vision of America that could inspire people to build a better future. The following morning, several major news networks requested interviews. The segment had sparked a national conversation about political rhetoric and how Americans talk about their country. 3 days later, public opinion polling on the Economic Opportunity Act showed a significant shift. Support for the bill had increased by 7 percentage points, with many respondents citing the televised debate as influencing their view. A week after the appearance, Karoline received a handwritten note. To her surprise, it was from Representative Ocasio-Cortez. "While we clearly have different perspectives," AOC had written, "I appreciated your respectful approach to our discussion. Our democracy needs more substantive debates and fewer personal attacks. Perhaps we can find some common ground on future legislation." Karoline placed the note on her desk, next to an invitation to speak at a conference on restoring civil discourse in American politics. Her approach, calm, factual, and optimistic, had resonated not because it destroyed the opposition, but because it offered an alternative to the anger and division that had come to dominate public debate. As she prepared for her next appearance, Karoline remembered what her former boss had always told her. Facts over feelings, optimism over outrage, and always believe in America's capacity to overcome its challenges. That philosophy had served her well in one of the most watched political exchanges of the year, and it would continue to guide her as she worked to promote a vision of America that could unite rather than divide.